Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We've been reading from Imam al-Nawawi's Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran, Etiquette with the Quran. And we're in the longest chapter of the book where Imam al-Nawawi goes through several particular adab and behaviors that one should observe while reciting the Quran. And so far we've talked about the need to have ikhlas and ihsan when reading, the need to ponder what one recites and to really think about it, to recite slowly, the permissibility of repeating a verse, as well as the recommendation that one weep while reading and why that would be the case, how they would bring it about so they would feel the need to weep. And in the last segment, we talked about supplicating as one reads the Quran. And Imam al-Nawawi mentioned that whether one is praying or simply reciting outside of prayer, and whether one is leading others in prayer or being led or praying alone, that it is recommended when one passes an ayah of the Quran where it would be appropriate to make dua or to affirm Allah's attributes and transcendence, that one should do so. And likewise, that one passes something that we should want to avoid, we should ask Allah to keep it from us. And when there's mention of His mercy and His maghfirah, that we ask for it. So this was the last thing we read. And there were some questions about whether this was just for obligatory or for recommended prayers. And it can be done in both. Okay, because anyways, we'll skip the evidence, but yes, it can be done in both. Okay, so in today's segment, inshallah, Imam al-Nawawi is going to talk about the need to avoid certain things when we recite the Quran. And so the author of our text, rahimahullah, says, among the things that should be emphasized is protecting the Quran from matters that some heedless reciters may neglect when gathered together. The emphasized etiquette includes avoiding laughter, clamor, and conversing during a recitation, with the exception of absolutely necessary words. Now, he does say that these are things that tend to happen when people are gathered together as a group, but many of these things would also apply when you're alone. Okay, it's just the typical case of his time is that it would happen when people were together, because people do distract one another, and if one person's reciting and the other ones are listening, then the people that are listening might be getting a little bit bored and then want something to do, and then they would bug the person next to them. Okay, so even though he says that there are things that might be neglected when people are gathered, they can also happen quite easily when one is alone. Okay, so he says among the things that should be emphasized is protecting the Quran from matters that some heedless reciters may neglect when gathered together. The emphasized etiquette includes avoiding laughter, clamor, and conversing during a recitation, with the exception of absolutely necessary words. This complies with the example of the statement of Allah Most High, where He says in Surah Al-A'raf, and when the Quran is recited, listen to it and pay heed that you may obtain mercy. So in this verse, we have a condition and then we have a command. And the condition is that when the Quran is recited, listen to it and pay heed. This is a command not only to the person doing the recitation, but it's a command to the people that can hear it. Okay, so he says we should avoid laughter, clamor, and conversing during a recitation, with the exception of absolutely necessary words. We could add to that that if we're in a place where these things are taking place and we can't stop them, then we should try to move to a place where we can avoid those things. Today, if you have a cell phone, put it on silent. If you're reading in front of a computer, turn down the volume. If you have the TV on, mute it. If you have a radio on, turn it off or mute it. And try to reduce the sound distractions that are around you. Try to get some control over the situation where you're reciting if you can. If there's loud noises around you, close windows, turn off equipment, whatever. Do what you can to try to reduce the distractions. Avoid unnecessary words. Later on, he's going to talk about what to do if someone addresses you while you're reciting. But the general rule here that we can apply is if you don't need to, don't respond verbally. If raising a hand would be enough, if a gesture is enough, you can do that. But the idea is that you don't want any noises to be above the text of the Quran when it's being written. You don't want our own sounds to drown out the sounds of Allah's words. Okay, and all of this is in compliance with the verse from the Quran. And when the Quran is recited, listen to it and pay heed that you may obtain mercy. So listen to it. You have to be able to hear it to listen, right? You got to be able to hear the recitation to really listen to it. And why? So that you can pay heed to it. So we're commanded to listen to it, and we're also commanded to pay heed to it. So it's not just that everything else is low enough that you could listen to the Quran if you want, but you're gonna treat it like background noise. No. Listen and pay heed. This is one of the reasons why I wouldn't play Quran in my office, because you know when you work, sometimes you want something going on in the background just so that you can keep track of time or whatever. Well, I wouldn't do that with Quran unless you can actually pay attention to it. And I wouldn't do it with Quran unless I can be pretty sure that people aren't going to come in and talk over it. Use anashid, use the news, use something else that's permissible to listen to, but I would avoid doing it with the Quran, because background music in your office is something that you kind of tune out, right? So out of our adab to the Quran, I would recommend against ever putting it on in a situation where you not only can't hear it, but you can't listen to it attentively and really think about what's being done. So in addition to what he's talking about talking over the Quran, I would also add treating it like background music. Okay? So if you need something in the background, find anashid, put on news, open up a book on tape. Okay? Listen to War and Peace. Okay, so anyways, the reciter should follow what Ibn Abi Dawud related about Ibn Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, and his father. Whenever he recited the Quran outside of prayer, he would not speak until he had finished what he wanted to recite. Bukhari related this in his Sahih, and he said he did not talk until finishing his recitation. And he mentioned this, Ibn Abi Dawud related this in his book of tafsir, where Allah mentions verse 220, where he mentions the tafsir for verse 223 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Okay, so what's the important thing? That whenever Ibn Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was reciting Quran, he wouldn't stop and speak about anything until he finished what he wanted to recite. So if he wanted to recite a particular surah, he wouldn't interrupt it. If someone came to him, he wouldn't stop the recitation and start talking to them. He had a goal of what he wanted to recite, and he would continue reciting that portion until he got to the end. Now, when we talk about needlessly, we're obviously acknowledging that as a general rule, all things being equal, we don't converse about anything else while we're reciting or hearing Quran being recited. We acknowledge that there are going to be exceptional cases. A child is about to fall into a wall. Someone's about to stick their finger into the electrical socket. Someone who can't see is going to fall over something. A snake is about to bite someone in the foot. We can come up with somewhat far-fetched, rare examples like I just did. These things don't tend to happen in our times. Okay? But there are things that do happen. So if there's danger, obviously we are going to switch from paying the respect of keeping, of not talking over the Quran, and we're going to preserve life. Okay, so yeah, we're pretty pragmatic about this one, and we're reasonable. But as a general rule, when the Quran is being recited, nothing should be higher than it. People shouldn't be talking. We should be not only hearing it, but we should be listening attentive to it. We should be contemplating and processing what is being said and taking heed. All of those things should be done. And when someone is going to sit down to recite something, they should have a plan of what they're going to recite, and they shouldn't interrupt it until they're done, unless one of the reasonable exceptions occurs, which would justify leaving it. Okay. Next, Imam al-Nawawi says other things to avoid include fidgeting with the hands or the like. Since one is addressing his Lord, sublime and most great, he should not fidget when in his presence. Okay, so one should avoid any sort of controllable motion. If they suffer from a medical condition which causes them to shake, then obviously that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people that have allowed themselves to get distracted and they start fidgeting. Maybe clicking their pen, spinning their phone, whatever. Snapping their fingers, moving back and forth. Okay. The list goes on and on. The important thing here is that you want to be on your best behavior. You want to show that your attention is fully focused on Allah. Imagine if you sat in front of a king or a president. Are you going to be looking off in the other direction? Are you going to be opening Facebook? Are you going to respond to phone calls? Or are you going to want to show that the person you're sitting in front of is the most important thing to you? When you read the Quran, you want to show, both with your heart and with your limbs, that your attention is on what you're reciting and what's being recited. So when this happens, when Quran is recited, we want to listen attentively, and we want to avoid fidgeting with the hands or other things. Since one is addressing his Lord, sublime and most great, he should not fidget when in his presence. And remember that when we make dhikr of Allah, Allah will also make remembrance of us, and there will be a greater presence than the rest of the time. Now, obviously, Allah is never absent from us, but when we are making dhikr and remembrance of Him, and reciting the Quran is one of those, it's an instance of that, then the presence is greater. Okay, so in the matters that one should avoid includes looking at what distracts and scatters the mind. And in our age, that definitely is going to include your mobile phone or other electronic device that's hooked up to social media or other communication channels. Okay. If you're reciting the Quran, whether it's on your phone or whether it's on a printed mushaf or whatever you're reading off of, try to reduce the possibility that you're going to be distracted by messages as you read. Now, if you're a doctor or involved in something where your response really is required, fine, we can understand that. Okay, I remember once that Sheikh Samir Anas, Hafidhullah, was giving, I think, a talk to us in Damascus for Eid, and he was giving a talk, and during the talk his phone rang, and it's amazing this adab he had where he apologized to us for stopping his discussion, and he explained that he was on call, that even though it was Eid, he was on call, and so he had to stop the discussion, and he had to look at his phone, and it ended up being a call from the hospital, so he had to bring the discussion to an end and leave. Okay, if you're someone who is a doctor or a policeman or someone whose attention really can be required because lives hang on it or welfare hangs on it, okay, fine. Leave your notifications on and program them correctly so only the ones that you need to see while reciting the Quran would come through. Okay, the point here is that you're supposed to minimize to the extent possible any distractions that might occur while you're reading, so that you're going to have presence of mind and you're going to be able to focus on what's being read and benefit from the Quran. Okay, so those are some ideas that I have on how to reduce this. Anyway, so we're supposed to minimize our fidgeting, we're supposed to minimize glancing about, we're supposed to minimize what would distract us. And then he says, more abhorrent than these things that he just mentioned is looking at what is impermissible to look at in general, though it is permissible out of need, to look about when buying and selling. Okay, so if you're in the souk, if you're in the marketplace and you're reciting, you shouldn't be looking about, right? You because you're reciting the Quran, you shouldn't be looking about. But if you're engaging in buying and selling, or you're driving your car and there's some other things, excuse me, I just lost my track. Okay, there are things that we're not allowed to look at except for out of need. So for example, if you're a male, an adult male, you're not allowed to look at an adult female who is not your wife and not your permanently unmarriageable kin. You're not supposed to look at any part of her body, with the exceptions of when you're buying and selling, you might be able to see her face, because you need to be able to see her face in order to identify her. Or if you're bearing witness, you need to be able to see the person to identify them. If you're a doctor, you might need to look at a part of the body of a member of the opposite sex for medical treatment, etc. Okay, so when we are reciting, we are supposed to avoid looking at anything that's impermissible for us to be looking at, except the things that might be permissible to be looked at out of need. Okay, so he says, and more abhorrent than all of these is looking at what is impermissible to look at in general, though it is permissible out of need to look about when buying and selling. Okay, so someone who's reciting the Quran, yes, it's okay for them to look about a bit while buying and selling, and when taking and giving. Okay, and he also mentions regarding medical attention, teaching, and the like, and other areas of need. Okay, so most of the examples he's giving are areas where we have exceptions. Okay, there's things that typically we're not allowed to look at, but there are exceptional cases where it would be okay to look at. For like when we're doing a commercial exchange for the sake of identification. Okay, when giving medical attention to a member of the opposite sex, we can look at parts of their body that otherwise we wouldn't be able to look at. When teaching, some of the scholars say that when you teach, it can be permissible to look at someone's an adult of the opposite sex's face, so that sometimes it is justifiable to do that while teaching, and other areas of need. Okay, so if there is a general need to do it, then there may be a sufficient justification for it. And this really is something that is covered in fiqh lessons, and I don't want to go into too many more details here. Okay, so more abhorrent than all of the things he just mentioned is looking at what is impermissible to look at in general, even if it is permissible out of need. So when you recite the Quran, assuming you're an adult male, if you're reciting the Quran on the bus, you really, really need to avoid looking at women that are not your wife and are not part of your unmarriageable kin. And you shouldn't be looking at other things that are unlawful to look at. You should also avoid just looking at things that are offensive as you go through there. Some scholars even would say that it's unlawful to look at violence, even if it's simulated violence. Okay, so anyways, when reciting the Quran, don't be distracted, and definitely don't be distracted by things that are typically okay, but definitely don't be distracted by things that are unlawful. Now, the thing about not looking at adults of the opposite sex, we know that if you go out in public today, this is next to impossible to avoid. And we typically will send people to other schools that are not quite as strict as we are on this. We understand that because of general need, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to follow the mu'tamad, the official position of the Shafi madhab. We know this. We send people to a madhab on this issue where that other madhab is more relaxed. Okay, if you're going to do that, okay, so that when you're out in public, you don't have to walk with your feet, with your face down at the ground with blinders on. Okay, you know, an animal. When you have an animal walking down the street, you're gonna put blinders on it so it's not distracted by everything around it, right? Well, that would be very difficult for you to do in public, right? Our societies, as they are today, would break down. So yes, we acknowledge that when you're in public, you're going to have to follow the more relaxed madhab. Great. But if you're in public reciting the Quran, isn't it appropriate for you to stick to the strict ruling? So when you're reciting the Quran, avoid things that are going to be distracting. Avoid things that are unlawful for you to be looking at. Avoid things that are offensive to look at. Okay? If while we recite the Quran, we're supposed to be staying away from things that are offensive or questionable, then definitely we need to be staying away from things that we know are unlawful, but we pick a lighter ruling from one of the other madahib. Okay, so when you recite the Quran, that is a time to try to be more strict. Anyway, in all situations, it is unlawful to look with lust, whether at a man or a woman. And by the way, this applies whether you're following the strict opinion in the madhab or whether you find that you are justified to take the rukhsa from another madhab. In all situations, it is unlawful to look with lust, whether at a man or a woman, and whether the woman is unmarriageable kin or not, except looking at one's spouse. And some of our Shafi companions said that it is unlawful to look with lust at his unmarriageable kin, such as his daughter or mother. The general rule in the Shafi madhab is that unless you're looking at your spouse, it is unlawful to look at something with lust. Now, I did say something, and I meant something. Whether it's a human being, or a rock, or a mannequin, or a reflection, or an image on a screen, if you look at it and you feel your heart excited, then you need to look away. Okay, so in all such situations, it is unlawful to look with lust, whether at a man or a woman. And notice he says at a man or a woman. So here's an acknowledgement. If you're excited by anyone or anything, even if it's not typically excitable, then you need to look away from it. And if that's the general rule when not reciting the Quran, then when reciting Quran, it's even more the case. And when praying, it's even more the case. So really, when we recite the Quran and when we pray, we need to try to control our environment as much as possible so that we remove the possibility of seeing what's unlawful, and we remove the possibility of excitement. Okay, because why? I mean, people are going to say, oh, you guys are just, you're overboard, you're Victorian in this. No, because the whole point here is that you want ikhlas, you want your recitation to be solely for Allah, without any distractions whatsoever. Okay, and even though this might be a little bit too blunt and forward to say it, even if you're at home and your wife is in the room when you recite Quran and you're feeling excited while you do it, go somewhere else. Go to another room to recite. Have ikhlas with Allah and have ikhlas with your wife. Be with your wife and give her full attention, and be with Allah and give Him your full attention. Okay, so try to remove any of the distractions and anything that would cause you to fidget when you recite. Okay, and then of course Imam al-Nawawi ends the section with, and Allah knows best. I'm going to read one more small section, even though the lesson or the segment has gone on much longer than I wanted. He says that someone attending an assembly for recitation and who sees one of these censured things that we mentioned or the like, he must forbid it to whatever extent possible. With a hand for someone who is able, and with a tongue for someone unable, with a hand but able with the words, and if not with a hand or tongue, then he censures with his heart. And this is an obvious reference to the hadith about commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. I think it's hadith number 34 or 32 in the 40 Nawawi, in the collection of hadiths that Imam Nawawi continued. Ibn Salah started the collection. Imam Nawawi carried it on in his Bustan al-Arifin, and then he wrote a separate collection of 44, 45, or 46 hadiths. And then Ibn Rajab comes along and he completes it with, I think, 50. So anyways, it's a great collection, and around number 34 or 32, he talks about this, he brings the hadith where all of the things that he just mentioned are established. So anyways, if you're in an assembly where the fidgeting is going on, then try to stop it. And maybe just putting a hand on the person who's fidgeting would be enough to remind them not to do it. Go lightly. Use minimal force. Do whatever is minimal in order to stop them. So anyways, we could go on and talk a lot about the conditions for enjoining the right and forbidding the wrong, but it's something that perhaps would be better for its own segment. If you have a copy of Sheikh Nuh Keller's Reliance of the Traveler, you should look in chapter Q, where he has translated from Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin, which is an abridgment of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, and he talks about the conditions, the various conditions for commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. So if you have time, you should go look there, or if you've covered it somewhere else, it would be a good time to review that. So anyways, this is all I'm going to read. My apologies for going longer than I said that I would. And in the end, and Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.